Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pennsylvania edition of our webinar series exploring state findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat 2040 Choosing an Abundant Future report. Here's the agenda for our hour together. And before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. You've been muted, so don't worry about any noise in the background. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do that by looking at that control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow at the top of that panel, which allows the panel to shrink or reopen. In that panel, you see a questions section. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, and then you can write in any questions or comments, and we will be getting to those at the end of the hour. We are also going through maps on the interactive website. If the control panel gets in the way, just click on that orange arrow and the control panel will shrink so you can see the maps. Also note on the control panel that there's a handout section. In that handouts, you have a link to the full report and the executive summary, as well as the Pennsylvania State Summary, which we'll be looking at when we get to the interactive website. Lastly, we're recording this webinar, so you are able to share this recording with any and all folks. We hope you share it widely, not wildly, but that too. And it will be sent to you and to everybody who is registered for this webinar. So let me now introduce myself and my co-host. I am Chris Coffin. I direct AFT's National Agricultural Land Network, which is an information and peer learning network for professionals and community advocates who care about saving farm and ranch land. I am also AFT's Senior Policy Advisor, and I specialize in farmland protection, land access, and farm viability work. Co-hosting with me is Jamie Murat, Mid-Atlantic Regional Director for AFT based in Washington, D.C. So before I turn it over to Jamie, let me just take a minute to talk about AFT. We are a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some of you know us best by our bumper sticker, No Farms, No Food. We take a holistic approach to agriculture. Our national initiatives and our regional programs focus not just on protecting the land base, but also on the practices used on the land and on the farmers and ranchers who work the land now and in the future. As another one of our bumper stickers says, it's not farmland without farmers. Our programs and our research together inform our state and federal policy development and advocacy. And we have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. And with that, let me turn it over to Jamie to introduce our special guest.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today. We'd like to recognize and thank USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service for their partnership and financial support of our Farms Under Threat research. Farms Under Threat is AFT's multi-year initiative to document the status of and threats to America's agricultural land base. NRCS has been an integral partner on this research, along with our other research partner, Conservation Science Partners. For this report, we've had a second research partner in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And now I'd like to welcome a very special guest, Doug Wolfgang, Director of the Bureau of Farmland Preservation at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, who is here on behalf of Secretary Redding. Doug grew up on a grain farm in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. He earned his bachelor's degree at Shippensburg University. Doug has been with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture since 1998 and has served as the director of the nationally recognized Pennsylvania Farmland Preservation Program since 2007. As many of you know, Pennsylvania leads the nation in the number of farms and acres permanently preserved for agricultural production. And in fact, Pennsylvania reached a really important milestone earlier this year, permanently preserving its 6,000th farm and more than 6,000 acres of prime farmland. Doug also oversees the Clean and Green Preferential Assessment, Agricultural Security Area, Farm Vitality Planning Grant, and the Century Farm programs. Doug, you're a very busy man, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jamie and Chris. Appreciate the opportunity.
Wonderful. So Doug, you've had a chance to review the summary findings from the report. I'm curious, what struck you most about the findings?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, Chris and Jamie and American Farmland Trust, thanks for your advocacy and your leadership in putting together this report. I know a lot of hard work went into it, but it's very comprehensive and detailed, and I think it has a lot of value for us in Pennsylvania and across the nation. But what struck me the most about the report is how strongly it reinforces the need here in Pennsylvania to continue preserving farmland even after that 6,000 farms that we've protected. There's 1,200 more that remain on our backlog list waiting to be preserved. And, you know, from the economic perspective, food security standpoint and conservation and environmental benefits, increasingly climate change, and the ability of well-managed farmland to capture and store carbon compared to other land uses, just critical on so many levels that we don't stop this work and that we keep going. But the study is, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but looks in 3 different scenarios: business as usual, runaway sprawl, and better built cities. So even under that business as usual model, which for us means preserving roughly 200 farms every year, we're projected to lose an additional 500,000 acres through 2040. Under the better built city scenario, by comparison, those numbers are cut nearly in half. You know, so better built cities, I see that first twofold. First is increasing the pace at preserving farms by boosting funds for easement purchase, and then second, apply smart growth principles and reinvest in our cities and towns. We should encourage policies that revitalize urban areas without gentrifying communities. Pennsylvania continues to lose traditional farms, but yet there's tremendous growth in urban farms and urban agriculture. And what are the opportunities there? There's a definite public benefit in securing urban farms that are located in close proximity or within environmental justice areas or in food deserts. Over 1 million Pennsylvanians at risk for hunger. So many of those disadvantaged populations are located in cities. So look for additional funding for urban agriculture under the next farm bill. And, you know, I see this study as maybe a way to help heighten awareness about that issue as well. So anyway, what struck me the most is how applicable it is to our scenario or our situation and our goals in Pennsylvania. Better built cities has practical application here. Philadelphia is the 6th largest city in the United States. We have Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Scranton, Erie, Lancaster, Reading, you know, cities that we all love and cherish, surrounded by farmland that is some of the most fertile non-irrigated soils found anywhere in the nation. Both are so critical to protecting and investing in, and the work in one area will enhance opportunities in the other. So I really see that as a value in this report.
Doug, how do you think this research can be used by the folks who are joining us here today to help save farmland in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so one word comes to mind there, Jamie, and that's advocacy. The people on this call are the best advocates for farmland preservation in Pennsylvania. Remind local officials why it's important to continue supporting the program. Remind our lawmakers around budget time. We just have a budget that passed. Why it's important to continue our funding or increase funding, even better yet. You know, remind our congressional delegation about why they should continue to increase funding under the conservation title of the upcoming Farm Bill. And then, of course, use it to educate the public on why these investments are so critical for the future of Pennsylvania. Farmland preservation impacts the lives of all Pennsylvanians, either directly or indirectly. We're a national leader, as you mentioned, with the number of farms and acres we protected, and we wouldn't have that status if it wasn't for public support, which dates back to 1987 when we had that first bond referendum statewide, which was approved by wide margin. But we know there's so much more work that needs to be done, and so being able to have a tool that, puts numbers with that quite frankly are alarming, I think is going to be beneficial for us moving forward.
And my last question for you now, Doug, is what steps would you like to see state or local or even federal government take to reduce the conversion of farmland?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania here, deeply concerned about the continued loss of farmland to large lot residential subdivisions and commercial development. Pennsylvania, warehouses in particular, stands out to me right now. Pennsylvania, as the Keystone State, is a transportation corridor that connects Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast with the rest of the country. And if you drive that I-81, 83, 78 corridor, it's one warehouse after another on prime farmland. Just use an example, Walmart recently announced a 1.8 million square foot warehouse is opening, distribution center outside of Shippensburg. They tout 600 jobs, and that's very important, obviously, to have jobs. But what is the net loss of jobs for this relentless loss of farmland to warehouse development? I believe agriculture is about 20% of Pennsylvania's gross domestic product. So we just can't afford to lose agricultural lands like that, from an economic perspective. So to answer your question, I'd like to see Pennsylvania personally have stricter rules on conversion of prime farmland to other uses, whether it be commercial or residential, and even utility scale solar development, if that development isn't compatible with farming. Pennsylvania as a commonwealth is made up of 2,500 municipalities with authority to make local land use decisions under the umbrella of county comprehensive plans. So local governance is deeply rooted here in our culture. Pennsylvanians are fiercely independent, and we should respect and honor that moving forward. But that said, we should consider more incentives or even directives to steer development away from prime farmland soils. By comparison, there are limitations that exist for wetlands and threatened and endangered species. So why not considerations maybe for farmland? It's all about balance, and they're never easy discussions or easy issues. But maybe this report could be used to help advance some of those discussions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. I'll turn it back to you now, Chris. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And Doug, it is always you have so many wonderful insights. We really appreciate you being with us. We know you're going to stay with us for the rest of the webinar. So if folks have questions for Doug, please feel free to put them in the chat as well. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can. But right now, we are all going to turn off our web cameras here so that we can start in on the findings and look at the website. So diving into the findings, this report, unlike the last two Farms Under Threat reports, which looked to the past to document actual conversion, this report looks and models potential future conversion of farm and ranch land out to 2040. How do we do this? We started with our Farms Under Threat State of the States analysis of conversion from 2001 to 2016. And as a reminder, that analysis mapped conversion of land to two different types: urban and high density development, or what we call UHD, and low density residential development, or what we've dubbed LDR. And I will use those as shorthand. Let's look at those two conversion and development types. So UHD is the traditional culprit in farmland conversion that folks have mapped and tracked for many years. So what's in that? Expanding residential areas, industrial areas, commercial development. It's largely found in and around cities, but it also includes rural development sites, such as oil and gas infrastructure and solar development. Basically anything that can be identified by satellite remote sensing as paved over and built up, or just built up actually. Low density residential development has become a larger culprit around the country, and AFT and our partners have pioneered an approach to match and quantify the impacts of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. We found that LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to large lot sprawling farmettes and ranchettes. Typically, this kind of scattered large lot housing fragments the agricultural land base and makes production harder for the farms and ranches that remain. Now, we understand that not all of this land has been converted out of agriculture. Some commercial agriculture is found on LDR land, particularly smaller parcels on the urban edge, and these parcels can obviously be quite profitable and very viable. But one thing to keep in mind is that we found that once land has been converted to LDR, it is far more likely to be further converted to UHD. So starting with that historical data, we projected into the future with the business as usual scenario. Basically a straight line projection using the same annual conversion rate as what we documented from 2001 to 2016. We adjusted the model to account for projected population growth or decline. Building off that business as usual scenario, we developed two alternative scenarios that Doug mentioned, and we'll get to those two in a minute. But in each of the scenarios, we also mapped the coastal flooding risk that is projected by sea level rise driven by climate change. Once we had our projection of conversion and flooding risk, we quantified the effect of these scenarios, looking at the impact on agricultural land types, so cropland, pasture land, woodland associated with farms, as well on the quality of the land converted. As with any modeling exercise, there are some caveats. Most importantly, we were not able to account for local zoning. Zoning is inherently local, and there's no national database of local land use regulations. So at the local level, our maps represent the general pattern and rough estimate of conversion that is likely based on those conversion patterns from 2001 to 2016. But to keep in mind, those patterns and that conversion from 2001 to 2016 reflected the zoning regulations that were in place during that time period. Our modeling also does not include the impact of water scarcity and potential fallowing of land because of water scarcity or salinization. Mapping the impact of water scarcity involves a complex interplay of many variables and was beyond the scope of the analysis. But you'll see in the web app, though, that we did include a data overlay from World Resources Institute Aqueduct, which does show that Pennsylvania faces some projected water scarcity by 2040. So here are the three scenarios we modeled. Again, first, business as usual. That's the straight line projection out to 2040. The second scenario is what we call runaway sprawl. So this envisions a scenario where sprawl actually gets worse, driven by how high housing costs in urban areas and more remote work opportunities, which are likely to improve as rural broadband expands. In some parts of the country, we may actually already be on this trajectory. Lastly, we modeled the future that we hope for, which we called better built cities. This scenario envisions successful efforts to minimize the impact and the footprint of residential, commercial, and industrial development on productive ag land. We recognize the need for some development, especially affordable housing, which is why this scenario still results in the conversion of some agricultural land. A quick look at the assumptions that went into the three scenarios. For business as usual, you see that, again, we followed the historical rate of conversion. That adjustment for future population growth was only done for the urban and highly developed conversion. That is because there's a strong correlation between urban and highly developed land and population growth. Since there's not that same strong correlation with low density residential development, we did not include population changes in that rate. In runaway sprawl, we did the same rate of urban and highly developed conversion, but we included a 50% higher conversion rate in the business than the business as usual. And then in the Better Built City scenario, we modeled a 25% reduction in UHD conversion and a 50% reduction in LDR conversion from the business as usual scenario. Research has shown that this level of urban development density is possible. And we went with a more aggressive 50% reduction in LDR because we're not dealing with the same level of population density in the areas characterized by LDR development. So we felt that a 50% reduction in LDR would be an achievable and ambitious goal. So this next chart shows each scenario's potential impact. The gray bar shows that from 2001 to 2016, we've already converted 11 million acres of ag land in this century alone. You can see that in business as usual, or even worse, runaway sprawl, we could see another 18 to 24 million acres of farm and ranch land converted or threatened by conversion. And conversely, with Better Built Cities, we could reduce that footprint on productive agriculture and have just 11 million acres. So you might be thinking 11 million acres is still a lot. Is that really the best case scenario? Can't we do better and minimize the impact further? We maybe could, but we appreciate at AFT that development is necessary, including renewable energy development, and the need for affordable housing options is acute. While it may be possible for cities and towns to be even more compact in their growth, we chose what we consider to be a realistic scenario. So these next two slides we hope are helpful in showing how Pennsylvania compares to other states. This one shows the projected total acres converted by county. The darker the red, the more acres will be converted, and you can see in Pennsylvania already a lot of that conversion is in the southeast quadrant of the state. The next slide compares the percent of agricultural land in each county that is projected to be developed. And you see here a slightly different development pattern based on the fact that they are, for the most part, smaller parcel sizes and smaller total acreage in the east. So going on to the next chart, you see here that Pennsylvania is one of the top 12 most impacted states in the country in terms of total acreage that is projected to be converted. Pennsylvania just barely avoided being on the top 12 list of states that would lose a large percent of their agricultural land. Pennsylvania's number is, for business as usual, is 6% of its agricultural land could be threatened or converted. So it's not far off of this chart. And then lastly, I want to look at the quality of land that the modeling shows will be impacted. For our previous Farms Under Threat report, AFT created the first ever index of agricultural land quality that identified what we called nationally significant agricultural land, which is land best suited for long-term cultivation and food production. While this land is concentrated in certain parts of the country, you can see that every state has a little bit of this land as well. What we find in our projections is that the conversion of this land is likely to be higher than the conversion of all agricultural land. For many of the reasons this land is so productive, it's relatively flat, relatively free of rocks, well drained. It is also the most desirable for development. And the loss of this land is especially concerning. This is land that can produce the highest yields of crops and livestock with the least environmental impact. Our modeling shows that nearly half of the projected conversion from 2016 to 2040 will occur on this land, even though it only represents 38% of the farm and ranch land base. The more significant, nationally significant land converted, the more reliant we become on marginal land for food production and for land, as Doug noted, that will require irrigation, and Pennsylvania is one of those few states with a lot of very fertile non-irrigated land. To put the potential loss of 9 million acres of nationally significant land in perspective, the total acres of land in the U.S. devoted to fruit, nuts, and vegetable production is just 10.4 million acres. So as you can see from this next slide, Pennsylvania is projected to lose a significant amount of its most productive land, over 355,000 acres. We'll see this more when we move to the web app, but this projected conversion is largely in the southeast quadrant of the state. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, who's going to talk through the next slides, and then we will go to the website.
Great, thank you, Chris. One of the other threats we are highlighting with this report is the threat that solar development poses to agricultural land. To be clear, the American Farmland Trust supports renewable energy development. However, we think it's essential that we plan carefully so that our most productive, versatile, and resilient land is not compromised. We also think it's possible for agriculture and solar to coexist in mutually beneficial ways. So this map shows the projected acres of utility scale solar photovoltaic energy generation facilities by state in 2040. This data comes from the decarbonization with electrification scenario of the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Futures Study. That study estimates that there will be 7.4 million acres of utility scale solar in place by 2040 to meet the Biden administration's energy goal. The next map shows the percentage of undeveloped land projected to be used for solar development based on that same Department of Energy Solar Future Study. We did model conversion of land to solar energy, but we did not include that layer in this report because of some issues with the data. There is some information about the solar modeling results in our solar technical paper, which is available through the Farmland Information Center. We will also be releasing a solar white paper later this year. The most important findings were that 83% of the projected solar development by 2040 will be sited on agricultural land, and nearly half of the projected solar will be sited on nationally significant land. So now we're going to dive into the data available for Pennsylvania on the interactive website. And Chris, I'm going to throw it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, and let me just say we are going to be ably assisted in our cruise through the website by our colleague and website navigator, Beth Fraser. So thank you, Beth. When you start, you will be met with this handy overview. It talks about what we did, what we found, what you can do. It's basically a very quick summary. To get out of it, you just click that little X up at the top. And if you are itching to get back into it, that little tab up on the right-hand side that says About gets you right back to it. Again, let's focus on that upper right-hand corner for a minute. You'll see a How-To tab. That tab takes you to a 5-minute video that explains how to use the various data layers in the scenarios. The View Report tab takes you to our Farmland Information Center, where Beth is going right now, where you can find the full report and the executive summary of this Farms Under Threat 2040, as well as the past reports, the State of the State and the initial one that was done in 2018, looking at national data. We are making our geospatial data layers available to the public. If you would like them, the Request Data tab up there on the right is the place to learn more and make that as what Beth is showing us right here. Okay, so now Beth is going to zoom in on Pennsylvania, and all you do is click on the state, and you will see it gives you automatically the state level information as well as information on whatever county your cursor happens to be on when you click Pennsylvania. So let's look at these initial numbers. You can see here that there is an estimated over 500,000 acres in the business as usual, most of which is Low-density residential development. Obviously, that runaway sprawl is even higher with over 760,000 acres. And you can see the difference if we really try to minimize the impact on productive land of the better built cities and how much less would be involved. In Huntington County, you see again that it's even more low-density residential development that is going to be the likely culprit for additional conversion. As you go down, let's take a little glimpse at what this first page also tells you. It talks about the acres of what we've talked about, land with high productivity, versatility, and resiliency values, or PVR land. And you can see the impact here in terms of the scenarios, and quite a bit of that land that will be developed, projected to be developed. If you look further down, you see here what type of agricultural land is likely to be converted, again with the significant amount of it being cropland, some being pasture. And this woodland, just to keep in mind that this is not all forest land. This is woodland that is associated with a farm or a ranch, which is what we mapped back in 2020. So again, this is woodland that is part of a farm unit. Pointing out at the very bottom, this LDR paves the way for further development. In Pennsylvania, agricultural land that was in LDR in 2016 is projected to be 5 times more likely to be converted to UHD by 2040. So important to keep that in mind. Going back up, let's look at how you download the state report. So this nifty little blue button here, we're going to take a minute to show what you've got here. And this is a document that we hope that you all will print off, that you will use as a talking point with legislators, anybody else, county planners, you name it, to talk about this report and the risks. So here you see again what we've talked about in terms of the conversion. You look at these numbers in the middle. We used the 2017 Census of Agriculture to derive from the spatial modeling the impact on the loss of farms. So potential loss of farms of 4,600, which would result in a likely 575 million decline in farm output and the loss of 11,000 jobs in the agriculture arena. And over here you see, and we will come back to it in a minute, sort of the hardest hit counties by what is the total projection levels, conversion levels. Going down, the rest of it is just more information, including what the reduced impact would be if we in fact focused and were able to achieve better built cities. So that is the summary. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie, who is going to take us on a further cruise into some of the mapping at the county level.
Great, thank you, Chris. All right, Beth, let's take a look at York County, which is one of the top 3 hardest hit counties. Great. So here you see Beth has selected York County. She is zooming in here. We can get pretty close in. And then, Beth, would you go to the left side of the screen and in the drop-down menu, select Runaway Sprawl. Thank you. And then move over to the right side of the screen and you can choose from the drop-down Better Built Cities. Excellent. So you can see a significant difference in development between the runaway sprawl scenario and the better built city scenario, with, again, low density residential development in orange. Again, these are the scattered subdivision large lot houses being a really significant issue. You can see a little bit, maybe less so in the red of the urban and highly developed areas of conversion there again in red. Then if you, as Chris kind of walked us through at the state level, maybe Beth, if you can scroll down a little bit, you can see the projections on between the 3 different scenarios and the graphs, and then also you can take a look and see the acres of Pennsylvania's best farmland projected to be converted between 2016 and 2040, and how that breaks down into cropland, pastureland, and woodland. Again, as Chris mentioned, with cropland being a significant part of that in York County. So that is a really quick run through of the mapping tool. I hope that was helpful. And Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Great, thank you. One thing to mention in the maps is that American Farmland Trust has created, with the help of many land trusts and programs like the one that Doug runs, a protected agricultural land database, or what we call PALD. That database will be released further this year. We did use that database along with other data of protected land generally in our modeling, so that when you look at the county level, you should not see conversion on land that is already permanently protected. It's not included in the maps here, but we just want to make sure that people are aware, particularly in a state that has so much protected land, that it was acknowledged and incorporated into the modeling scenarios. So let's go out of the website and go back to the PowerPoint. And now that we've discussed the findings, we want to take a few minutes to talk about action. And I loved what Doug said. He had a lot of good ideas already. But really, what can each of us do to help choose an abundant future? So our report has policy recommendations in each of these 4 categories. If you were a county or municipal official, and given that there are 2,500 municipalities in Pennsylvania, that's a lot of you, or a state legislator, state agency employee, congressional staffer, these recommendations are all tailored for your particular level of government, from local up to federal. We hope that you can find a recommendation that you can champion and encourage you to do that. So please let us know if we can provide you with any additional information about any of the recommendations in this report. And if you are a farmer, a rancher, community advocate, land trust, we encourage you to share and discuss these policy recommendations with your elected and agency representatives and partners. But let's talk, just to highlight a few examples of what you can do in each of these categories. Encouraging smart growth. We tend to think of smart growth and compact development as urban issues, but compact development is a significant issue for rural communities as well. And one of the best mechanisms for denser development in small rural communities is via accessory housing units. So allowing residents to create mother-in-law apartments, or to convert space in a barn or other farm building for additional housing, can help to both expand affordable housing options and create additional income streams for those who have otherwise unneeded space. Yet accessory housing bylaws are often contentious at the local level because of concerns over views, noise, parking, you name it. So that's one idea. Protecting agricultural land. As Doug mentioned, Congress is going to be writing a new farm bill next year. An important program in that bill is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which helps to fund farmland preservation in Pennsylvania and around the country. More funding for that program would help to mean more additional protected acres on the ground in a state like Pennsylvania. Advanced smart solar siting. Local governments can ensure that best practices are being followed when siting solar on farmland. This includes best practices for construction, operation, and decommissioning to preserve soil health, water resources, and the ability of a farmer to farm the land during and after the life of the project. States can also invest in additional research around agrivoltaics or dual-use solar and provide incentives for dual-use solar development. And then supporting farmland access, let me just say here, hats off to Pennsylvania for all that you have been doing to address farm transfer and land access. The innovative programs you put in place, so the Ag Mentorship Program, the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit, the Realty Transfer Tax Exemption for protected land, the succession support for exiting farmers. Holy smokes, they're models for the rest of the country, and all I can say is don't take your foot off the gas. And with that, let me turn to Jamie for the next slide.
Great, thank you. Before we turn to questions, we want to touch on some resources that we have available and some of the things that AFT is doing in Pennsylvania. So as Chris mentioned, community planning is critically important to smart growth. As part of this planning, AFT encourages communities to plan proactively for agriculture. This involves these 4 basic principles that can work in tandem with efforts to plan for smarter, more compact development. Many resources on planning for agriculture can be found on AFT's Farmland Information Center website, and we hope you'll go and check them out. So what does this mean for Pennsylvania? Since there's no statewide planning agency or smart growth plan, it's especially important for communities and municipalities to create their own plans that consider the importance of agriculture to the character, economy, and ecology of the community. Community planning that includes smart solar siting principles as well as mapping of significant farmland can also help ensure that solar development happens in a thoughtful way that benefits agriculture instead of replacing critical farmland. AFT is supporting this work in Pennsylvania in a number of ways, and there are several opportunities for engagement. We encourage land trusts, planners, agency staff, and anyone working to save farmland to join AFT's National Agricultural Land Network, which Chris mentioned earlier. There are conversations about planning for agriculture within the network, as well as many other helpful resources. We are very excited to be working with partners, including PASA, the Pennsylvania Soil Health Coalition, Penn State, and NRCS to engage women farmers in the Susquehanna River watershed through a Learning Circle cohort launching this fall that will focus on soil health as a foundation for setting and meeting farm goals. We are also partnered with farmland preservation groups to increase awareness and adoption of soil health principles and practices on preserved land through AFT's Soil Health Stewards program. In both cases, improving soil health can help agricultural land be more productive and more valued as a community resource. And finally, I encourage you to contact me or a member of our small but mighty Mid-Atlantic team to explore ways that we can support you in the region. All right, Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And I think I'm going to turn my camera back on, and Doug and Jamie, if you want to do the same. Actually, I encourage people to put in any other questions. We have one at the moment, and the question is, how is low density residential defined in acreage? And let me answer that, but then Doug, I will get the second part of this question is, I'm curious what Doug thinks about Clean and Green's 10-acre minimum and whether or not that encourages the subdivision of large residential lots off of farms. Hang on, let me try and turn my webcam back on. There we go. So let me talk a little bit about how the low density residential, how we did that. And it is, I actually am going to refer people to the report. It goes into quite a lot of detail in Appendix 1 about how the how LDR and UHD were defined. Essentially what we did at the county level was that we took what is the lowest, well, I'm going to read this in fact. We identified a conservative minimum size threshold using the 10th percent of each county's farm size distribution from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. Then we identified U.S. Census blocks where the average acreage per dwelling was below the county's minimum farm size threshold. So I assume, I don't know what off of the top of my head, what that the bottom 10th percent would be in terms of average farm size for Pennsylvania. I'm going to guess that, you know, it could be in the kind of 10 to 20 acre, but Doug, I look to you for your thoughts on that and about the clean and green question.
Yeah, so just some quick background on clean and green for those on the call who don't know what that is. That's a preferential assessment program where land is assessed according to its value for farmland or forest land rather than fair market value. Very widespread with over 10 million acres of privately owned land across the state. In fact, it's our earliest land preservation tool. State constitution was amended back in the early 1970s to provide for clean and green. So it's been around for a long time, but the question about whether it facilitates large lot subdivisions has been around for a while. I will say that the program itself is instrumental in preserving farmland because we can't have viable farms without affordable property taxes. And farms would have been lost to development years ago had it not been for clean and green. But that said, some of the categories besides ag use for active working farms are ag reserve and forest reserve. They've been controversial over the years because there can be 10-acre divisions of those tracts, and each one of those tracts is entitled to an improvement, which could be, a residential structure. So if it's not an active working farm, and certainly we're seeing that 10 acres of a farm can certainly be viable and productive. Our average farm size is going down, and we're seeing that, some larger traditional farms are being, carved into smaller farms that are still very productive. So in that case, I would say, clearly it's not a disadvantage, but I would say that in some cases anyway, limited cases maybe of the ag reserve and forest reserve category, it could be used as a tool to facilitate other types of subdivisions. General Assembly actually passed a law, amended the law back in 2003 or 4 to at least allow county assessors to value where that residence is located on that type of tract that is carved off at its fair market value to help offset some of the, reduction in assessment. But that issue and that criticism has been around for a long time for clean and green.
Great, thank you very much for that. Let me go to the next question, and I would be interested, both Jamie, in your thinking and Doug's. Let me talk for a minute about what the question is. Have you found best practices for engaging local municipal officials? They seem to have the highest degree of land use regulatory power. You are absolutely right on that question. I'm going to offer two perspectives on that. Best practice is actually to become a local municipal official, right? If you are one, you have a great deal of say, and running for many things at the local level or being appointed is not. I come from a small town. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated when you're from a bigger community, but in a small town or county level, there's not always a whole lot of competition for some of those elected positions, and getting yourself appointed to something is very helpful. The other thing that I would say is showing up at meetings, being engaged, just being there, again, because the act of being present in a meeting is an opportunity to be engaged and offer perspectives. And so those are my two very simple answers, but I would welcome Jamie and Doug's perspectives.
I'm happy to go first, Doug, or second, I guess. Chris, those are really important perspectives. And I would just add really to meet your local municipal officials where they are, find out what they know and maybe some of what they don't know, and then looking to really kind of educate and bring them along so that they can make really well-informed decisions. And there are so many incredible resources out there that AFT and many others have produced. And just want to mention the Farmland Information Center again as a really great kind of one-stop shop for a lot of resources that may be helpful to you in those conversations and in that kind of education as well. Doug, do you have anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just real quickly, the first step in the process of preserving a farm in Pennsylvania is a prerequisite is for that farm to be located in the township's agricultural security area. That's a designation at the local municipal township level. Ag Area Advisory Committee is formed by the township supervisors to designate these areas, and it becomes a stamp of approval essentially for that farms located in an ag security area to eventually go on to be preserved potentially. So there's there's opportunity there to become involved, I would say, to reach out to township supervisors and, remind them of the benefits of ag security areas and the ag area advisory committees, if they're active, to engage with those members. But that, and also we have a good working relationship with the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors. They have a conference once a year. We're invited to their regional workshops and conferences every so often. So you definitely just the engagement and at the most local level, just by, attending meetings, as Chris said, and Jamie, and just making sure that they're aware of the issues and giving your perspective as it relates to farmland, I think is very critical.
Great. So the note here, I'm just looking at these questions. There's another question, which is, what is the best way to educate residents and landowners or managers in rural areas about the importance of preserving agriculture and other natural lands? Again, Doug, you have been in this business in Pennsylvania for so long. I think I would look to you for your thoughts on this, on what has been the best way that you have found to engage landowners about the importance of protecting agricultural land, and as well as the sort of communities at large.
Yeah, so what we do in Pennsylvania, as you know, is we partner with 58 counties that fall under the umbrella of the state program. And at the county level, our volunteer board members, there are about 400 board members across the state in those 58 counties that really work to champion the program. And there's a lot of trust, I believe, that was gained by the farming community by having local board members who know the farms, who know the farmers, and can have those discussions and work with the county staff who are so diligent and know so much about the farming community in their area. So I think those local grassroots engagements are most important. But I think it's important for us at the state level then to provide whatever support and leadership we can to see that those conversations are occurring and that there's not barriers in those discussions.
All right, Jamie?
Yeah, if I could just briefly mention, in 2020, AFT did a survey of non-operating landowners in Pennsylvania to kind of better understand what barriers they have to conservation on their rented land, including land protection. And the findings of that, so the Pennsylvania survey was part of a broader survey in a number of different states across the country. I'm more than happy to make the results of that available to anyone who's interested. But we found is that compared to other states, the non-operating landowners, so the folks that own farmland but lease it to farmers in Pennsylvania, unlike many other states, they live much closer, if not on the land that they lease. They are already engaged in a lot of conservation and land protection programs, and that they are very familiar with farming. And we also surveyed folks in terms of what type of information are they interested in and who do they trust most, who do they want to hear that information from, and how to best engage with them. So there, again, some really interesting findings that I think can help inform outreach to some of our landowners. And again, I'm happy that's again on the Farmland Information Center, though I'm also happy just to share the link with anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you. We have one more question, a couple more questions. One that is an excellent one that would take a very long time to talk through, and I hope that he doesn't mind me calling him out of who it is, the questioner, which is Professor Tom Daniels, who asks what standards for agricultural zoning are needed to achieve better built cities. It really is a great question, and I suspect that Professor Daniels has good opinions on that. And I think it is, I think one of the AFT does some work on agricultural zoning and thinks about planning for agriculture. I think it's a little complicated, and I would hesitate to give a full answer given the agricultural districts and how that relates then to agricultural zoning or what would be thought about. I don't know, Doug or Jamie, if you would like to field this question, but I think that my response, my immediate response to Professor Daniels is that I would love for us to do a webinar or a conversation, a workshop in Pennsylvania about what some of that ag zoning would be needed and how actually we can move that needle further. But let me stop there and ask Doug or Jamie for thoughts.
Just agree that that would be a really, important discussion to have as it relates to zoning. And Tom, where he's from in Lancaster County, they're really pioneers in zoning and urban growth boundaries and establishing those types of districts. So, I think it would really be a value to have Tom in that discussion to
absolutely
sort of hone in a little bit in detail as it relates to zoning and what is needed to meet that better built cities.
So Tom, if you're game sometime, we would welcome a further conversation. And what we can say to everybody on this webinar is that if we can set up something, we will be back in touch with letting you know about that. We also, I should say that any questions we don't get to, we will include a written response to. We can also put in some resources that we have on that we have available through the Farmland Information Center. And I'm glad that there are a couple of people who have already weighed in saying we'd love to hear more about effective ag zoning. Absolutely, we understand how important this is. So let me transition because we want to let everybody leave promptly at 3 o'clock. Let me take a minute to just talk about the two resources that you see here on this slide. AFT runs the Farmland Information Center, or the FIC as we call it, in cooperation with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. They are a wealth of information. They have a huge number of reports, of state laws, of any kind of resources. If you are looking to suggest to a landowner background materials on how to protect their land, they can be sent to the FIC. If you have a question you want to know about what a different state does in terms of land access or farmland protection, you can write them an email or actually pick up the phone and call that number, because people do answer the phone. So again, consider them a resource. The second thing I'll talk about is the network that I mentioned this earlier at the start of the webinar. This is a free network. It is for anybody who is interested and who does work. It doesn't need to be in a professional capacity, but if you are really rolling up your sleeves and looking to understand more about how to save farmland, we are the place for you to come. We are relatively new. We are still looking for programming ideas. So I think ag zoning and Tom, we will be in touch to rope you into those conversations. So we hope that folks will consider joining the network, and that's the URL on how to get there. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie to close us out.
Sure. Well, just very briefly, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for your great questions. Thank you again to Doug for joining us and for your really helpful insights and the very important work that you're doing. Just a reminder that you can find the full report and our mapping tool on our website at farmland.org. And if you have any further questions or are interested in more conversation or obtaining our Farms Under Threat data, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Chris or any other member of the AFT team. So thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Doug.
Jamie, Chris, thank you so much.
Okay. Good afternoon.